Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order. We had planned to do transportation today, but as we were meeting on Monday, whoever it is that downloads trailer bill language was busy downloading trailer bill language that's very relevant to our committee. Obviously on very short notice, but we're here today to hear from the administration about these trailer bills, get as much information as possible so that we can act on them by our deadline tomorrow. So if you'd like to come forward, we'll take roll while you're doing that, and we'll get right into it.
Bloom.
Here.
Gordon.
Here.
Obernolte.
Here.
Patterson. Williams.
So welcome back. And I imagine we'll just take these one by one and hear public comment at the end of the presentation of all of the trailer bills. But we'll stop after each one to allow members to ask questions that they might have.
Sure. Good morning, Member Bloom. Michael Waffer, Chief Counsel for the State Water Resources Control Board. I'm joined by Chris Calfee with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and today we're going to walk the committee through the proposals. Before I begin hitting them serially, I thought I'd provide a little bit of context. Some of this the committee's well aware of, but we're facing our fourth year of drought in California. All 58 of our counties are facing severe drought conditions. The most recent snow surveys have been horrible, 2%. They're record low levels. We are seeing reservoir levels depleted because of the cumulative effects of the drought. We are seeing communities go without water. The water rights priority system in California is having to be vigorously enforced for the first time in about 30 years. And we're being, because of the low water levels, being forced to consider going further up the water rights priority system than we've ever had to go before. The state has had a very dynamic and robust response to the drought. It has been both at the administrative and legislative level. This has been reflected through the acceleration of funding, new regulatory programs to provide flexibility for drought relief, and the legislature has stepped up with 2 rounds of emergency drought legislation. After the most recent round of drought legislation, during the signing ceremony, both legislative leaders and the governor committed to continuing to look for efforts to promote the state's drought response, not only to provide immediate relief to extend potable water supplies, especially to extend those supplies in a local way, since there's increasing concern that this drought may be protracted and that we won't be able to rely on consistent deliveries through the Delta or even the state or Central Valley water projects to ensure deliveries south of the Tehachapi or to the San Joaquin Valley. In addition, the response and the call for legislation has looked to what we can do to promote our long-term drought resilience. The package of trailer bills that the administration released earlier this week is designed to do just that. We've identified a number of actions that could be taken in the immediate term to provide immediate benefits to extend local potable water supplies and to promote long-term drought resilience. Collectively, the trailer bills allow the state to expedite the disbursement of funds available as a result of Proposition 1, expedite projects that in the short and long term can promote drought-proof local water supplies, enhance local authority to implement local conservation ordinances and statewide conservation efforts that will extend local potable water supplies, and improve reporting frequency and quality of water diversion data so the state can more effectively implement the water rights priority system. So with that introduction, I'll turn to the first of the trailer bills. It's denominated 820, and this is for expanded local enforcement authority. Some of you may have heard about this earlier this month when the governor had issued a statement in conjunction with a meeting with the mayors from around the state of California, and that he would be promoting an effort to enhance local enforcement authority. Presently, local water agencies have a diverse mix of authorities to enforce their conservation ordinances, and some have no authority to enforce their own conservation ordinances. Last year's emergency drought legislation included a provision that allowed local agencies to pursue an infraction of $500 per day for persons who violated emergency drought regulations adopted by the State Water Resources Control Board. Unfortunately, some local agencies were not able to exercise that authority, and it also involves going to the court where there are questions about the authority they have to pursue those. And then even if the enforcement action is pursued through court, there's then a complicated cost-sharing approach available to distribute the penalties. The governor's proposed legislation in Trailer Bill 820 would provide a minimum set of enforcement tools for local agencies. It would allow the local agencies to enforce their ordinances as well as the State Water Board's emergency conservation regulations, and it would establish a penalty threshold of up to $10,000 for the first 30 days of violation. No additional penalty would accrue until after the 30th day of continued violation. Local agencies would be able to pursue these penalties through either the court system or through an administrative enforcement process that conforms with due process. This is fairly common amongst many of the local agencies as well as the state agencies, and this would allow in one sweep a uniform system to come into place. Any of the penalties assessed pursuant to this process would have to be directed towards local conservation efforts. And with that, I will conclude my summary of 820. And I can either move on to 823 or answer questions related to this one.
Well, let me start off with one question, and that is how does the enforcement authority that you're proposing in this trailer bill differ from that the State Board already has?
So a couple things. First of all,
I realize it's at the local level, but...
Yeah, and that's an important difference. I mean, obviously, we have at the state level a fairly compact enforcement unit that can certainly not be out in the field to the same degree that local agencies are. It's different because, first of all, it applies to the local ordinances. The State Water Board has been undertaking a number of emergency rulemaking proceedings and have set statewide conservation minimums. Some local agencies have had to go well beyond those. So this allows them to enforce those local. In terms of how the penalty is different than the State Water Board's authority, the factors that go into what is an appropriate penalty are essentially the same. The nature and extent of violation, what corrective action was taken by the individual, whether or not there was, for example, disregard of a notice that had been provided by the local agency, because most of the local agencies, just like the State Water Board, go through a progressive enforcement process that starts with, hey, we've identified a problem, knock it off, and they only mature to a penalty enforcement action if there's repeated violation or disregard of those notices. So in that respect, it's the same. In terms of the quantity of the penalty, the State Water Board's authority is somewhat different. It's pursuant to the emergency drought legislation last year, it's a $500 per day up to, and all these penalties, I want to be clear to everybody, are up to the penalty amount, $500 per day, but it can accrue throughout that first 30-day period. So theoretically, under the State Water Board's authority, you could end up with, over the first 30 days, a maximum penalty of $15,000. For the local agencies, it would be $10,000. And then if there was continued violation after that, they would, on the beginning of the 31st day, be able to have an additional $10,000 penalty, and then it starts matching the State Water Board's authority at $500 per day. If you follow that math, they're very similar in terms of total amounts. It's just a different paradigm, and some of that was because local agencies were saying part of what they need is the incentive to comply, and having a larger number in the front end encourages compliance in the first instance. And that's the real goal here. I mean, people get fascinated by penalty amounts, but the real goal is conservation and how do we send the right signals for people to conserve.
Given that, and that these penalties could be, if they're inappropriately used, devastating to a small business or a resident in a local community, what protections are built into your proposal to prevent abuse by by local governments, local agencies?
Well, there's an explicit provision that talks about the various factors the local agencies have to take into account in setting the penalty, and all of these penalties are ultimately subject to judicial review. I think it's entirely speculative whether any local agency would abuse this authority and try to push towards the maximum, but everything can ultimately be reviewed in court, where it's subject to essentially an independent judgment standard of review by the superior courts.
We would like to think that those circumstances wouldn't exist, but I think it's our responsibility to understand that they might and provide some protections. I know some local ordinances provide for warnings first before taking action, for tiering violations, but not all are going to do that. And I worry that with the approach that you're taking, the potential for mischief is there. So that might be something that we want to take into consideration in discussing this this language. Are there any other questions, Mr. Obernolte?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I join the chairman in being a little bit concerned about such a large expansion in the statutory authority for the maximum amount of penalty. The statutory authority right now is, what, $1,000 per violation?
It's an infraction, so a slightly different species of penalty, and it's $500 per day.
$500 per day.
And this,
okay.
The proposal here would allow a $10,000 penalty for the first violation, but then another penalty could not accrue until after 30 days of continued violation.
Okay, so this is a violation of a water conservation program.
A water conservation ordinance adopted by the local agency, or an emergency drought regulation or water conservation regulation adopted by the State Water Board.
Okay, so if a local water agency has an ordinance that says outdoor watering is only allowed on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you water your lawn on a Tuesday, you can be fined $10,000?
Theoretically, yes. However, that's not the way local agencies have carried out their existing enforcement authority. Most of them are, like I say, focused on compliance, providing notice, following a progressive enforcement. And I think if you were to look at the factors that are enumerated in the trailer bill, the gravity of the violation and the individual's conduct are the types of factors that have to be taken into account in setting the penalty, either by a court or by the local agency through an appropriate administrative enforcement process. And I don't think anyone in their right mind would, in considering those factors, think that a $10,000 penalty would be appropriate for the first violation of a watering ordinance, for example.
All right, I understand. I'm trying to be difficult, but I just want to understand where the number, the $10,000 for the first violation, comes from. So can you come up with a hypothetical of a situation where you think a $10,000 penalty for the first violation would be warranted? Can you?
Mr. Williams.
I want to speak in support of this. I represent jurisdictions where...
Well, Mr. Williams, I apologize for interrupting you, but I'd like to give the person asked the question the opportunity to answer first, and then
okay.
I appreciate you've got a response. And
I just have some of the agencies that have most immediate examples, which is stealing water, where you in one area.
Right. Mr. Obernolte's okay with it, so
okay.
We'll let you
in
take
one
off.
area, you hook up a truck, a massive truck. You take the water from there, and you sell it in an adjoining territory in violation of the ordinances. These are businesses that are making massive amounts of money stealing water from one jurisdiction to sell them in another. And you can't enforce that with $500 violations. That is just simply impossible to enforce a law when people are making massive amounts of money with $500 violations.
All right.
I'll add to it.
Yeah, and if I could...
Let's, rather than have colloquy, see if we can...
So one thing to keep in mind is this is captures a broad suite of conduct. And like I said before, the agency needs to, or the court needs to consider the various factors. You could have a situation where the agency, for example, has notified businesses or residents of the ordinances repeatedly, and the quantity of water that has been used in violation of the ordinances, filling an ornamental lake with thousands upon thousands of gallons of water, could very well warrant a $10,000 penalty for the first violation. Likewise, part of the structure of this language is it provides wholesalers for the first time the ability to enforce their ordinances, including against their local retailers. And that could very well be a situation where the $10,000 penalty becomes appropriate, because you could have a local retailer who is retailing water to its customers and not imposing restrictions, not following the overall tariffs or ordinances established by the wholesaler, and this provides a mechanism to ensure that those are enforced. So in the end, I do not see a situation where, it would be applied in the context of somebody who leaves on an outdoor faucet by mistake, or waters on the wrong day, or their power goes out. That's the classic progressive enforcement. But if you had an absolutely outrageous conduct, the local agency would be able to go up to the maximum, and I think it's good to send them that flexibility. And in part, it has to do with, again, that deterrence value. People are much more willing to pay attention to if they think that there will be a significant pecuniary risk. And again, the ultimate goal is compliance. I mean, we need to extend the local supplies. This is just one tool in the local toolbox.
All right. Well, I just am trying to make sure that we're being thoughtful and not arbitrary when we set the maximum. And I get a little suspicious when it's a nice round number or a multiple of what we had before. And again, we're talking about water conservation programs, and I think the situation that Mr. Williams raised, might not fall under conservation, might fall under another different penalty clause. But I actually like the example that you raised about the ornamental lake. You could see where that might be something where we would need a fine. I have to think about whether or not $10,000 is the right amount there, because and I realize, I read the trailer bill language. I realize that willful violation will subject you to a greater potential penalty than non-willful violation. But even if someone had filled an ornamental lake like that in ignorance of the fact that they weren't allowed to do so, $10,000 would seem a little draconian. So that's my concern. But thank you for answering the question.
And my concern, again, is not the intent of this. I can see a very strong rationale for having a enforcement mechanism that has some teeth in it. My concern is that there is some opportunity for abuse. You are right. You used the term actually yourself that most jurisdictions, and then you went on to say what our expectations would be from most jurisdictions. I'm not so concerned about most jurisdictions. I'm concerned about that lesser number, which would probably be very few, but for a very few individuals, the result could be devastating. And I'm not given much solace that individuals who might be subject to this have the ability to go to court to redress their grievance here. That isn't necessarily a practical alternative for them. Again, and I will say this once and hopefully not be a broken record in this proceeding. This is why we have policy committees, so that we can have in-depth conversations about issues like this and make sure that we are being responsible in our efforts to protect the public from not just bad actors who are out there in the water world doing things like Mr. Williams suggested, but also bad actors that might be out there in the enforcement world who deliberately or inadvertently abuse the power that we might confer upon them. Mr. Williams and Mr. Gordon.
Well, I have to say I'm far more worried at this point about bad actors using water inappropriately as we are running out of water than the possibility of an overzealous regulator at this point. Under normal circumstances, I might answer that differently. This deep into a drought with the crazy things that I am seeing in my district, we need stronger enforcement mechanisms. The example of water trucks very much fits into conservation ordinances. If you are not supposed to draw down a certain amount of water in one jurisdiction, but you only have to pay a $500 fine in that jurisdiction to then turn around, use a massive amount of water, truck it over into another jurisdiction where they're willing to pay ungodly amounts of money for that trucked in water, that is going to mean one jurisdiction is stealing from another, and the perpetrators of that are only paying $500 fines. And it is desperate times. I have the managers of water agencies following around water trucks because they don't know how else to enforce this, right? I have Montecito, where it has 10,000 people. At least 10% of the population are millionaires. That means that there's 1,000 people in that jurisdiction at least that have the means to say, hopefully most of them do not and respect the conservation levels, but most of them have the means to simply pay the $500 fines as much as they want and use as much water as they want. We cannot, and that does not just affect Montecito, because as I articulated, that means then there's a demand for water to be stolen from adjoining jurisdictions. So that means the entire South Coast is affected of Santa Barbara County as one jurisdiction tries to stop people from trucking water into a place where there's enough money where people can pay for it. And I don't know how else to enforce this on multimillionaires other than to have stronger fines. And I think that stronger fines, there's less of a danger in stronger fines than in using too much water. We are in that much of an emergency, and that's why I do think it's appropriate.
Mr. Gordon. And then
Thank
Mr.
you.
Patterson.
Having listened to the conversation, thought that I have and suggestion perhaps for us to think about would be that to craft some language into the trailer bill that encourages and or requires a local water agency to use a step approach so that there's some encouragement for them to be rational in their approach to the fines. And when you've got something that is egregious, they could have the capacity to go up, but I think we need to perhaps encourage them to step this in and consider that.
Mr. Patterson.
I wanted to echo the chair's concern about the fact that, and as the discussions have indicated here, we're now turning this budget committee into a policy committee. We really need to see these things going through the policy committees, and so I'm objecting to just the procedure that is happening here, because it does not afford the opportunity for all of the stakeholders and all the variety of people who have interest in this, particularly when we're talking about enforcement, when we're talking about fines, and when we're talking about deputizing employees of these jurisdictions with police powers. I mean, those are very serious, significant discussions that ought to take place. The other second concern I have is that I represent a couple of cities over the last 3 or 4 years who have done, both Fresno and Clovis, who have done and tried to plan and to get water usage down through water meters, through stiffening their own water regulations and the like. The problem is we feel as if, and again, this is why I think we need to be going through policy committees so that the variances of some of these circumstances can be at least heard by the decision makers prior to a threshold or fines. Because cities I represent 2 and 3 and 4 years ago did things that did significantly reduce consumption. But the arbitrary nature of choosing the particular year upon which the benchmark is made ignores what has gone on previous, literally tens of millions of dollars worth of projects and improvements and methodologies. So we then get essentially whacked for, I'm told we've got to now go another 25% below an already number that we have been able to, over a period of time, reduce. And so my office gets deluged by folks from my city and folks from Clovis, other cities particularly. There are a lot of things we can do and are willing to do, but it feels as if we are being penalized by an arbitrary benchmark without any consideration with respect to what is in the pipeline and what we've already done to see these consumption numbers come down. So that's why I think the policy committees, I mean, other than in this moment in time as these things come forward, their voices can only be heard by me in a budget trailer bill committee, rather than affording them the opportunity for the due process of legislative activity to take place. I do understand the urgency. I do believe that we can do, and I have seen it when individuals and interest groups seek emergency and quick policy hearings, they get it. And so I think we are heading too far, too fast, too quickly. I understand the urgency, but I do think another 2 weeks, I mean, I know we're coming into legislative, but there really does need to be some kind of a stamp of approval on a policy rather than merely a budgetary decision where there is no appropriation, there is no budgetary effect in any of this. So with that, I appreciate the opportunity to have a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to agree with what Mr. Gordon said. He did a better job than I did at articulating the concern. I think that these penalties need to be progressive. And if we're worried about the bad actors, a bad actor by definition would be a serial abuser. And I think that I have no problem with the penalties ramping up for someone that's violating it repeatedly and willfully in ordinance. But my concern is the first-time offender who is not willful and is unaware of the conservation requirements. And so I'm going to request that in the list of the determining factors for civil liability that you include whether or not the violation was willful, because that is not in here right now. We've got the nature and persistence of the violation, the extent of the harm caused by the violation, the length of the time over which the violation occurs, and any corrective action taken by the violator. But I think it would be good also to list as a factor whether or not the violation was willful.
Mr. Williams.
I think Mr. Obernolte makes a good point on the willful, having that be part of the criteria. I do want to dispute the nature of a progressive fine. The first time you catch somebody on filling up a water truck is probably not the first time they filled up a water truck. The first time that some of these violations are caught is probably the 10th, 20th, or 50th time they did it. So you need to not start off too low. And so I think that there are times that it is appropriate for an agency to assess a larger fine from the beginning, and I guess I wonder why not give our local agencies the discretion to be able to do that.
Mr. Chairman, all right, let's
Again,
try to wrap this one up.
To get into, but the presumption of innocence is still an important factor here, number one, and due process, innocent until demonstrated guilty. The notion that because somebody overwaters on a Tuesday when they should have been watering on a Monday, to suggest that may very well on the face of it, on the surface of it, demonstrate that it's been willful or done some other time before, number one. And number two, you got big trucks pulling up, stealing water. That's why we got sheriff's departments, we have police departments, we have district attorneys. It's not just a $10,000 fine that ought to be, but a due process of law under the protections of our system can go arrest, not only fine, but put in jail for the theft of water. So I think, of course they can.
There is no criminal penalty for taking water from one jurisdiction to another. You have to make administrative fines.
You just said the stealing of water.
Okay, I'm going to cut this off. We can continue to have this discussion.
I made my point about due process, and I made my point about innocent until proven guilty.
Please wrap it up. Okay. Well, you can see that these items are engendering a lot of conversation, and I think there's a lot of valid points being made. I want to stress for people who might be listening in, or for those who are here, that this is informational today, and we're not taking any direct action today on these trailer bills. Let's move on to 824.
I did want to note that I'd be happy to co-author a bill with Mr. Patterson to make a criminal penalty for such actions if you would consider it.